So we will go to have a review of Steve Woodford's recent video, how my views have changed after 5 years of YouTube. So let's start.
Why, hello, my fellow apes. I hope you're well. As the title says, I'm going to here explain how my views have changed over the last 5 years of studying science, philosophy, morality, and theology. As someone who's completely self-taught, I always knew that I was going to experience some significant changes here and there. But in many cases, I've been surprised by which of my views have changed, and more interestingly, why. It's been said before, and I'll say it again. One of the best things about being non-religious, about not having theological or philosophical commitments, is that one can truly and sincerely follow the evidence wherever it leads.
So here he says that he's open to permit the evidence to follow wherever it leads. So Steve, are you open to permit it to lead to theism, to the Christian God? Because you have already stated that you're a non-believer, an atheist. So you have already made up your mind. So how can you say that you are still open to permit the evidence to lead to God if that is the case? It seems to me that you have already decided that God is not an option for you. So that is simply false. You are not open to permit the evidence lead wherever it is.
No matter how unintuitive and quite frankly uncomfortable the conclusions might be. And some of the views I now have are extremely uncomfortable. But as a Russian proverb succinctly states, better to be slapped with the truth than kissed with a lie.
I agree with that, Steve. Now, the thing is, how are you sure that the no God world or no God hypothesis is true? And we will see. What do you have in order to back up that claim?
Now, as a disclaimer, please appreciate that I'm not 100% confident in any of my convictions, but rather I believe them over the alternative propositions. In some cases, I'm very confident, such as that I exist in some form, but in other cases, I'm only just persuaded of one position over another, such as that the multiverse exists.
Wow. You believe the multiverse exists, Steve. Based on what evidence? You probably are one of those which claim to be persuaded by scientific evidence. What scientific evidence is there that the multiverse actually exists? I think there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever. The only inference that is being made is that there is fine-tuning of the universe that requires an explanation. And since God isn't an option, then people like you resort to a multiverse. And there are so many problems with that hypothesis, starting with the fact that the multiverse also would require a cause. And then you would have to ask, what is the cause of that multiverse? And I mean, even if we suppose that that multiverse exists, let's have a quick look here about the various problems that are plagued with that hypothesis. Okay. Dawkins and many scientists allude to the multiverse as the best explanation for our universe. If there is an infinite number of universes, then absolutely everything is not only possible, it actually happened. This means the spaghetti monster must exist in one of the 10 to the 500th power of multiverses. It means that somewhere in some dimension there is a universe where the Chicago Cubs won World Series last year. there's a universe where Jimmy Hoffa doesn't get cemented shows. Instead, he marries Joan Rivers and becomes president of the United States. Secondly, suppose a dinosaur skeptic claimed that she could explain the bones by postulating a dinosaur bone producing field that simply materialized the bones out of thin air. Moreover, suppose further that to avoid objections to such as to there are no non-physical laws that would allow for such a mechanism, the dinosaur skeptic simply postulated that we have not yet discovered these laws or detected these fields. Surely none of us would let the skeptical hypothesis deter us from inferring of the existence of dinosaurs. Why? Because although no one has directly observed dinosaurs, we do have experience of other animals leaving behind fossilized remains, and thus the dinosaur explanation is a natural extrapolation from our common experience. In contrast, to explain the dinosaur bones, the dinosaur skeptic has invented a set of physical laws and a set of mechanisms that are not a natural extrapolation from anything we know of or experience. In the case of the fine-tuning, we already know that minds often produce fine-tuned devices, such as Swiss watches, postulating God as supermind as the explanation of the fine-tuning, therefore, is a natural extrapolation from what we already observe minds to do. Third, the many universes generator seems likely it would need to be designed as well. For instance, in all current worked out proposals for what this universe generating could be, such as the oscillating Big Bang and the vacuum fluctuation models explained above, the generator itself is governed by a complex set of physical laws that allow it to produce these universes. It stands to reason, therefore, that if these laws were slightly different, then the generator probably would not be able to produce any universes that could sustain life. Fourth, the universe generator must not only select the parameters of physics at random, but must actually randomly create or select the very laws of physics themselves. This makes this hypothesis seem even more far-fetched, since it is difficult to see what possible physical mechanisms could select or create laws. 5. It cannot explain other features of the universe that seem to exhibit apparent design, whereas theism can. For example, many physicists, such as Albert Einstein, have observed that the basic laws of physics exhibit an extraordinary degree of beauty, elegance, harmony, and ingenuity. Sixth, neither the atheistic many universes hypothesis nor the atheistic single universe hypothesis can at present adequately account for the improbable initial arrangement of matter in the universe required by the second law of thermodynamics. To see this, note that according to the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy of the universe is constantly increasing. The standard way of understanding this entropy increase is to say that the universe is going from a state of order to disorder. We observe this entropy increase all the time around us. Things such as a child's bedroom that start out highly organized tend to decay and become disorganized unless someone intervenes to stop it. To believe an infinite number of universes made life possible by random chance is to believe everything else I just said too. If you take seriously the theory of all possible universes, including all possible variations, Davies said, at least some of them must have intelligent civilizations with enough computing power to simulate entire fake worlds. Simulated universes are much cheaper to make than the real thing, And so the number of fake universes would proliferate and vastly outnumber the real ones. And assuming we are just typical observers, then we're overwhelmingly likely to find ourselves in a fake universe, not a real one. 8. The multiverse should be shaved with Occam's razor. We don't need it to explain reality. It's only advanced to keep from having to turn to God. It's naturalistic, so it's an arbitrary necessity at best. Arbitrary necessities are logical impossibilities. Contingent things jumped up to the level of necessity to answer a God argument. It's not we are going to disprove the unnecessary entity, but we are going to refrain from advancing its existence as an assumption until such a time that real empirical evidence makes it necessary. Therefore, multiverse should be taken out of the issues of God arguments. Let's keep listening to Steve.
Secondly, know that my purpose here isn't to defend my positions, and so don't consider what I'm about to say my thesis. If I've already expanded on my views elsewhere, then I'll provide a link. And if I haven't, but you'd like me to, then be sure to let me know in the comments and I'll escalate it on my list. Talking of which, I've just dropped a poll for patrons to vote on, which we can discuss along with other things in a live stream in a few days. What's more, I'm ready for the next batch of cartoon tiers to be created, and so be sure to look out for me in your emails. Right, let's get to it already. After Effects. Do your thing. Let's start with the central theme of my channel, religion. Why does it exist? I used to think that religion is merely, in Karl Marx's words, the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. I used to believe that religion is merely the opium of the people.
First of all, it's not about religion. It's about a relationship with our Creator. It is about having a fellowship and knowing who God is and following Him and having a hope of eternal life and being with our Creator. It is about finding the meaning why we actually exist. It is about finding truth of our existence. It is about finding answers in regards of our origins. So it is not about religions. It is about knowing God, knowing that He loves us, love Him, and following His commands, which are to love people. And I think if we all would follow that first golden rule which Christ gave and which is also stated in the Old Testament, then that would be a good rule to have a better and more just and more loving society.
Little more than a social construct to provide hope and control the masses through existential bribery. However, by deep diving into history, comparative religion, and evolutionary psychology, I've since become firmly convinced by the much more generous sociological view of religion. Yes, religions are make believe, they're fiction, but their fabric is woven by the subconscious as opposed to the conscious. No doubt, this fabric is fashioned by the powerful to fit their agenda, but the fabric itself is natural. This is to say that, more often than not, religious doctrines, practices, and myths embody a combination of the environmental challenges of those who conjured them and our psychological evolution as a species. It's not by coincidence that snakes, for instance, are so prevalent in religious stories, for they were our leviathan for tens of millions of years. Snakes were such a threat, in fact, that many ecologists consider them to be among the primary reasons for our forward-facing eyes and ability to identify camouflage objects. What's more, this evolutionary account easily explains why religious communities who were barely inconvenienced by snakes nevertheless prominently featured serpents in their myths. Such was the case with Celtic Britons. In my video titled An Atheist's Perspective of Religion, I provided a relatively detailed account of my current perspective should you be interested. It's my view that by understanding the intuitive notions and compulsions of the religious mind, we'll be able to save the babies in the bathwater. we'll be able to have, hopefully, a more productive and fruitful conversation. Springboarding from my sociological view of religion, my goal in regards to religion itself has changed. I once thought it possible for our species to surpass religion with a combination of compassion and reason, that by treating facts in a way that's sensitive to our state of mind, we can eventually emancipate ourselves from these primitive shackles. A younger me envisioned a future in which religion is relegated to the bin of astrology and alchemy, a world where only a very small percentage insists that we're the pinnacle of creation, the divine's favourite toy. But for reasons stated in the prior chapter, I no longer believe this.
Okay, Steve, we are not simply the divine's favorite toy. We are created upon God's image, and God is calling us into a personal relationship. And He has created us in order that we can know His goodness, His love, His character, who He is, and become actually even more His children. And this actually puts us into a privileged position as His creatures, and in a responsibility where we can actually decide also if we actually want this relationship with Him or not. So we are not just His toys, but we are free agents which can actually choose to come into that relationship with God. He doesn't want to have robots, toys, which have no free will. He has endowed us with that amazing freedom to actually choose what we want. And He has revealed Himself to us. And so we can make free choices and actually either receive Him as who He is, as God, and follow Him, or we can reject His offer of a relationship, of becoming His children, to become a part of His family. So we are not simply His toys, Steve. You have a straw man characterization of what God's purpose is when He created the humankind.
Possible. The mythos is in us as an operating system, and so no social, economic, or educational revolution is going to change this. Unless we alter our genes, religion is here for keeps. It will continue as it has throughout history to wax and wane, and if our standards of living continue to rise, I think there's a decent chance that it will wilt to the somewhat harmless woo-woo of New Ageism. We are in fact seeing this occur in real time with the Christian movement that's got Jordan Peterson at the helm. But yeah, the basic patterns, archetypes, and motifs are not going anywhere. We're an irrational ape that bears the stamp of our lowly origin, and that's simply not going to change. Given this, my goal is now twofold. One, to keep applying compassionate pressure so that religion will continue to wilt to such a degree that it's compatible with a secular state. And two, to establish a truly secular state, a state whose legal and educational foundations are entirely untethered to religion. A tall order, I know, but a possible one. Since my early teens, I've recognized the face of religion as arrogance disguised as humility, hate disguised as love, and a lobotomy disguised as wisdom.
What a nonsense that you are claiming here, Steve. What a nonsensical criticism. Our motivation and is to follow Christ's command to love each other. And I don't think there is a better moral command than the golden rule. So we are following Christ, and God gave us this command as a rule in order for us to create societies which can uh, be better and where we can have a better social construct. And we see that the Christian faith has actually influenced in history that the modern civilized world has shaped towards this principle. And we see that in many different manifestations. I can put here a link and we can quickly look what the Christian faith has actually done for us. First, what good has the Christian faith brought to us? Development of the educational system through Christianity. Indeed, it's impossible to study history without seeing the extraordinary role Christianity has played not only in the development of rational thinking, but also in the spreading of such thinking, that is, the creation of an educational system. And what of the criticism that religion is the enemy of art? Jack Huberman, in his book The Quotable Atheist, says, religious authority has always sought to control and censor art and literature. Likewise, Rob Boston writes in Church and State magazine, the truth is religiously based censorship of the arts by the government has a long history in Europe and the United States. Just as a scientific inquiry was founded on the idea that God and his creation are rational, so, too, was religious art founded on the idea that God and his creation are beautiful and that humankind, being made in the image and likeness of God, has the power and the responsibility to make beautiful things too. This is the philosophy that lies behind so much of the world's greatest artistic expression. And yet atheists continue to claim that religion has always been the enemy of art. Religion and freedom. They also contend that religion destroys freedom. But again, an unbiased look at history shows the exact opposite to be true. The biblical concept that all people are created in the image and likeness of God is the foundation of universal human rights, including freedom. Before Christianity, human life on this planet was considered cheap. Infanticide was not only common but applauded. Newborn children were routinely abandoned on the hillside, left to starve or to freeze to death, or they were killed outright through drowning, especially if they were baby girls. Adults didn't fare much better. Everyone had heard about Roman arenas like the Colosseum, in which the whole families were bludgeoned to death, mauled by wild animals, or burned alive just for sport. The greatest and most respected ancient writers and philosophers didn't object in the slightest to these barbaric practices. It was Christians who finally banned them. Why? Because the religious belief that all men are created equal is not a self-evident truth, as Thomas Jefferson famously wrote. To pre-Christian cultures, equality was a total foreign concept. Humans are moral agents. As Dinesh D'Souza says in What's So Great About Christianity, Christianity emphasizes the fact that we are moral agents. God has freely created us in his own image, and he has given us the power to take part in his sublime act of creation by being architects of our own lives. John Stuart Mill's influential doctrine of liberty, which so many of us take for granted, is a direct inheritance from Christianity. Human equality. The point that atheists refuse to grasp is that Christianity espoused a revolutionary philosophy of equality that set into motion an intellectual process that gradually changed everything. It was Christianity which rejected polygamy and adultery and exalted monogamous love geared towards the raising of children. This is the basis of the traditional family, and no matter how much secularists decry the institution today, there is still no other force more stabilizing and beneficial to civilization. Equality of woman. It was Christianity that dramatically elevated the status of women at a time when practically every other culture in the world oppressed them. The Bible and slavery. Atheists are always claiming that because Christians owned slaves at various times in history, the whole Christian religion is hypocritical. But that's nonsense. Slavery was practiced for centuries all over the world before Christianity came on the scene. No one ever criticized or opposed slavery in any systematic way until Christianity. From its very beginning, Christians discouraged the enslavement of fellow Christians, and many early Christians purchased slaves for the sole purpose of setting them free. Politics. Take the world of politics. We've seen how the idea that all men are created equal has its origins in the Bible. Well, the whole idea of limited government comes from Judeo Christian tradition too. The notion that there are certain God given, unalienable moral absolutes, such as the right to live, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that take precedence over any edict issued by a king, it derives from Christianity. Social engagement and charity. In the year 369, Saint Basil of Caesarea founded a 300-bed hospital, the first large-scale hospital for the sick and disabled in the world. Christian hospitals and hospices started springing up all over the European continent. These were civilization's first voluntary charitable institutions, and they were built and paid for by the church. So these are just a few things.
But I always suspected that by reading enough historical and contemporary literature and engaging in enough conversation, I'd come to recognize that behind the face is an intellectually rigorous foundation. After all, I reasoned, so many wonderfully intelligent people believe in a God, and there's entire courses and degrees dedicated to theology and apologetics. Whilst it might be the case that I'll never be personally convinced of theism, upon a day I'll surely appreciate that there's at least sufficient intellectual support for the proposition, and that given a sprinkle of divine revelation or personal experience, there's a considerable probability that it's true.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So here you actually admit that you are close and not open-minded to the God proposition. So you have already made it very clear that you are not actually interested to permit the evidence to lead wherever it is. You want atheism and materialism to be true, no matter what.
God exists. You know, similar to how we think of the multiverse today, there's a fair chance that it exists, but there's also a fair chance that it doesn't. There's good.
So why don't you actually believe it? Isn't it because it's the only explanation for the fine-tuning? If you want to remove God from the picture as the best explanation of fine-tuning?
Reason both for and against the proposition. Now, given the direction that my life took, I've been gifted with the wonderful opportunity of digesting a significant amount of theological content. From the historical words of Aquinas, Al-Ghazali, Paley, and Pascal to the contemporary words of Lewis, Craig, and Plantinga. And yet, to my surprise, I'm now less convinced of the existence of a God than I have ever been.
Of course, you shouldn't even be surprised because you started your inquiry with the will actually know God to exist. So you have actually interpreted all the information which you have digested in order to solidify your wish know God to exist.
To be clear, the more I learn, the more I'm overwhelmed by what little I know. Each book, each lesson smashes my ego, and for this I am very grateful. Most of my views have consequently weakened or indeed been shattered, but a minority of my views have only solidified. And one such view is that the various arguments for the existence of God, and especially the way in which they've developed in response to scientific and philosophical objection, are precisely as good as we'd expect them to be in a state in which there is no God. They're quite frankly awful. For me, the most convincing argument by far is Paley's watchmaker. The sheer complexity of our biology, the way in which, for instance, our system sends platelets to seal a wound, is an intuitively very convincing argument that we're the product of intelligent design. At least it was to me. But even a rudimentary understanding of evolution by natural selection completely neutralizes it. Like,
wow, really? It Are you serious? Really? Do you even understand where complex organisms come from? how the immune system works in order to come to that conclusion? I mean, have you studied biochemistry to see what mechanisms are actually in place, Steve, to come to that conclusion? I can give you a quick overview here, and I think that you have absolutely no warrant at all to come to that conclusion. The big umbrella contributor to explain organismal or phenotypic complexity, anatomical novelty, and biodiversity, which falsifies and replaces unguided evolutionary mechanisms, is pre-programmed, prescribed instructional complex information, encoded through at least 33 variations of genetic codes and 41 epigenetic codes. Complex communication networks use signaling that act on a structural level in an integrated, interlocked fashion, which is pre-programmed to direct growth and development, respond to nutrition demands, environmental cues, control reproduction, homeostasis, metabolism, defense systems, and cell death. Genetic and epigenetic information, Steve, directs the making of complex multicellular organisms, biodiversity, form, and architecture. This information is pre-programmed and prescribed to get a purposeful outcome. Each protein, metabolic pathway, organelle, or system, each biochemical structure and motion works based on principles that provide a specific function. Pre-programming and prescribing a specific outcome is always the result of intention with foresight, able to instantiate a distant, specific goal. Foresight comes always from an intelligent agent. Therefore, biodiversity is the result of intelligent design rather than unguided evolution.
Akin to a balloon, Darwin popped teleology. A contemporary of Paley, Percy Shelley, expressed frustration at just how poor the arguments for a god are in his essay titled A Refutation of Deism, which, for the record, is a phenomenal read. And I'll end this chapter by sharing just a few of his fine words. If God wishes to be known, cherished, thanked, why does he not show himself under his favorable features to all these intelligent beings by whom he wishes to be loved and adored? Why not manifest himself to the whole world in an unequivocal manner, much more capable of convincing us than these private revelations, which seem to accuse the divinity of an annoying partiality for some of his creatures? Would it not have been more in conformity with the views of a God so jealous of his glory and so well intentioned for mankind, to write, in a manner not subject to dispute, his name, his attributes, his permanent wishes in ineffable characters equally understood to all the inhabitants of the earth? No.
Okay, so here is my answer to that, Steve. Why does God not simply show himself to us? Without God's hiddenness, we would not have any significant freedom. Even those that hate God would be unable to fully live according to their wishes, much like a criminal would find it intolerable living in a police station. Atheists wrongly assume that God wants everyone to worship him because he is an apparent egomaniac. The hard truth is that humans don't have a choice to not worship, but only a choice on what we will worship. God, being visible to the senses, would make even that choice impossible. Besides, God is the foundation of all truth, beauty, life, and love. It would be like standing in front of all of the beauty of nature's grandeur and all the wonder of the cosmos at once. There is none who could not fall and worship at that point. Philosopher Michael Murray of Franklin and Marshall College makes the case that if God stays hidden to a degree, he gives people the free will to either respond to his tugging at their hearts or remain autonomous from him. This is what happens in the narrative of the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve are tempted by the serpent, God's immediate proximity to them is not evident. Perhaps the character is what you do when you think nobody is looking. What if, in the words of Blaise Pascal, God has only revealed himself enough to give us the choice of whether or not to believe? Pascal says, there is enough light for those who desire only to see, and enough darkness for those of the contrary disposition. If you prefer being an atheist, God values your free will more than his desires for you. If you are really after truth, then have an open mind and follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if you don't like the conclusion. So, Steve, you said that you would be willing to permit the evidence to lead wherever it is, but at the same time, you confirmed and confessed that you are an atheist. So, how does that go together? You would actually have to have a true position of agnosticism, of not knowing. But the Bible is very clear in regards of that. The Bible states that the created order and God's direct revelation actually they testify for God's existence. So we can either surrender to His revelation and receive Him as our God, or we can just adopt a position of rebellion. And frankly, to me, it seems that is your choice, your preferred choice to live independently from Him. And that's what your entire commitment is all about. Let's continue.
No one would then be able to doubt the existence of God, of his clear will, of his visible intentions. Under the eyes of this so terrible God, no one would have the audacity to violate his commands. No mortal would dare risk attracting his anger. Finally, no man would have the effrontery to impose on his name or interpret his will according to his own fantasy. Second only to religion, morality is a topic I've given much attention, and over the years my views have significantly altered. I went from a position of moral realism, endorsing Sam Harris's moral landscape, to a hedonistic anti-realist position, which I'll lay out in just a moment. Along this journey, I've had the opportunity of publicly soundboarding against my brother from another mother, Alex O'Connor, culminating in us both agreeing, at least that is on that day. I've also recently had an illuminating discussion with two moral philosophers, Kane B and Cole Nasrallah, which has helped me better convey my view in academic terms. It's actually been quite some time since I properly laid out my thoughts on morality, 2 years in fact, but since then there's only been one change. It is, however, a big one. I now believe that there's only one axiomatic ought, and it's to obey our hedonistic masters. In the introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, Jeremy Bentham wrote that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In a nutshell, this is how I currently perceive morality. There is nothing to say that you ought to value your well-being, that you ought to serve your hedonistic masters, but you do. Even the act of suicide is a final bow at their whims.
Well, Steve, this is just plain nonsense, and I will tell you why. If a person, Jeffrey Dahmer said, if a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. I always believed the theory of evolution as truth, that we all just came from the slime. When we died, that was it. There is nothing. There cannot be moral values if there is no God, Steve. because moral values, they are always coming from above. They are ought to be. They must be prescribed from an authoritative entity. And if there is no God, then it is just opinion. It is a mere opinion of what is right and what is wrong. Then you cannot say that the Nazis were wrong by killing Jews. You cannot say that the Papuas are wrong by eating their neighbors rather than love them. It's just a mere fact of opinion. It's a construct of a society. And if a society says it's okay to do a certain thing, then that's just a construct from that society. And if I am from a different society with a different kind of moral standard, then that means I have no objective right to criticize them, because my opinion is just as much worth than their opinion. So a world where there is no God cannot have objective moral values. But since we know that certain things are always wrong, that is in conflict actually with your worldview without God, because then you have to ask, why is it wrong that we should never torture and kill babies for fun? We know that it is wrong in all circumstances. And even if someone claims differently, that doesn't mean that that opinion then is right. We know it's always wrong. And you have to ask yourself, where does that come from? It is not something physical. That knowledge that doing certain things is wrong isn't something which comes from a physical being, from a physical entity. It is something which we know. We know certain things are wrong, but it is not physical. So if it is not physical, where does it come from? I think this is a very, very strong indication and argument for God's existence.
Mother Nature has seen that you're not born with a blank slate. You're born with the goal of minimizing your suffering. And there are scientifically, objectively, right and wrong ways to achieve this that are relative to the environment. Hence, in some state, X will be objectively the wrong thing to do, whereas in some other state, X will be objectively the right thing to do. This, of course, is made all the more complicated by the fact that we're a social species and that our hedonistic chains are tethered to our genes as opposed to our ego. Basically, morality is bloody complicated. As already said, I spelt out my views in the aforementioned video, but yeah, over the first few years of my time on YouTube, my thoughts on morality altered a great degree. I can't say that I'm entirely comfortable with the conclusions I currently hold. I prefer, for instance, for moral realism to be true, but I can say that I'm very comfortable with the consistency of my conclusions. They make sense of an otherwise insanely hypocritical state of affairs.
Yeah, it isn't that your entire position based on materialism, Steve. I mean, you need to be enormously hypocritical by actually holding moral values, by thinking that our life has meaning, because you cannot ground that on materialism. I mean, the universe doesn't care how you live, what you do. Once you die, you are just dead. That's it. And what meaning does life have if there is no God? I mean, only God can actually have an intention to make humans and creatures and the physical existence if he has a purpose and a goal. But if God doesn't exist and we are just the fruit and the product of a random happenstance and of a universe which just came to be by no reason and for no reason at all, by a lucky accident, then you cannot actually say that our life has any meaning whatsoever, or that what we do has a deeper meaning and that moral values actually exist. So you have actually to borrow all the time from the Christian worldview to make sense of the living order and of our existence. But you cannot do that, and you have no right to do that, because you don't believe that our worldview is true. So I agree with you. You have to take a hypocritical stance in order to hold to the materialistic worldview.
Now, here's the biggest change in my worldview that I've experienced as of late, and this one still regularly keeps me up at night. I used to find all variations of the multiverse to be quite frankly absurd. I knew that a lot of the most respected and elite physicists and philosophers of our time endorse it in some form, but it's always struck me as quite frankly too extravagant to be true. How is it that if there's a possible world in which the Earth and Mars have switched locations, then there's a decent chance that it's occurred? This just seems bonkers. It's not quite supernatural, it's not in the same ballpark as religion, but it's certainly extraordinary. This was my position for most of my life until I really considered what is surely the biggest question of them all. Why is there something rather than nothing? Now, it's near impossible to do this topic justice with just a few paragraphs, and so until I dedicate an entire episode to it, let me just recommend Sean Carroll's amazing podcast episode aptly titled, Why is there something rather than nothing? Seriously, if this question grinds your gears, give Carroll a few moments of your time. There's no
That's a very, very fundamental and important question, Steve. And I am absolutely certain that if there would be no creator at the bottom of reality, then we would still be in a state of absolutely nothing. But since we exist, what does that mean? Since something cannot come from nothing, then something must have been always without a beginning, eternally. And since it is not the universe, and it couldn't either be the multiverse, because the multiverse also requires a beginning, then there must be something or someone beyond the physical. And that physical, that thing beyond the physical must be non-physical, and it must be eternal. And then we come actually to a creator God which is eternal, and it must be a person because he created us with personhood, with will, with consciousness, with understanding, with the ability to talk, to use logic. How could matter do all these things? How could logic come from non-logic, from matter? That simply makes no sense. It is logical to believe that consciousness is in substance different from the physical, from matter. And if we have consciousness, then that means that there must be a greater conscious mind beyond the physical universe, which is at the beginning of all the created order and which had the free will to instantiate the physical. And that entity is an eternal creator, an eternal God, which makes that everything is behold in his hands and his power, and he is the one which instantiates what is impossible and what is possible. Now let's suppose that that creator wouldn't be at the bottom of reality. Then what would actually secure what is possible and impossible? What would secure the physical laws which are preordaining how the physical actually remains stable and makes an intelligible universe actually even possible? Let's continue.
no possible universe in which you'll regret it. My answer to this profound question is, drumroll please, I really don't know, and so I certainly wouldn't bet my house on any specific proposal. There is, however, one proposal that I find more plausible than any other, and I'm in good company. The proposal is simply that there's no such thing as nothing. Nothing, the absence of everything, is an abstraction and, well, nothing more. Again, this
No, it's not an abstraction, Steve. It is a state of affairs which is in contrast to something. The philosophical nothing is the absence of anything, and it is obvious that something cannot come from nothing. And I am surprised that so many atheists are unable or unwilling actually to grant that and to understand it, because it's not difficult actually to understand. It's very simple. It's the opposite of something. What is the opposite of something? Nothing.
needs more time to unpack, but why precisely does this entail a multiverse? Well, if there's no state in which there's nothing, then there's always been something. And if there's always been something, then that something has cyclically rearranged itself into an infinite number of constitutions.
No, Steve, you are completely dismissing the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the energy which is usable to do work is winding down. It's like a watch which you have to wind up and then it starts to run, but it has only a certain time where it can actually work. And once the energy is wind down, it stops to work. And that's exactly what we see in the universe, where we start with a universe in a low state of entropy, which is very ordered, and it winds down like a watch, like a clock, which winds down. And then in the future, there will be a state of heat death where the universe cannot perform any work at all, and it will just enter in a state of chaos, which is commonly stated as heat death. So, this is one of the reasons why the universe cannot be eternal, and consequently, as well, a multiverse. Both would require a beginning, and then you are still and again back to the question what caused the multiverse or the universe actually to exist and to start.
An infinite number of universes. This means that if there's a possible world, then there's a decent chance that it's occurred. After all, if you play the lottery an infinite number of times, there's a high probability, although not guaranteed, that upon a day you'll hold the winning ticket. Another reason I find this answer so compelling is because it also happens to trivially answer the so-called fine-tuning of our universe. Putting aside the fine-tuning of children dying of cancer and all the other injustice that we're beset by, the fact that our universe harbors intelligent life isn't extraordinary if the dice has been rolled an infinite number of times. The chances are that some universe will win the lottery, and why not us? I mean, if we didn't win the cosmic lottery,
So, do you see, Steve, what nonsensical claim that you have to adhere to in order to remain an atheist and a materialist? This is just an extraordinary claim, any evidence whatsoever. And you also contradict your claim that you are a rational person, someone which is making claims based on reason and evidence. And there is simply no evidence whatsoever in regards of the multiverse. It is one of the worst arguments ever which I have seen atheists bringing forward, besides other absolutely nonsensical claims like that Jesus never existed.
then we simply wouldn't be here to marvel at how unlikely it is that we might win the cosmic lottery. In other words, we're simply Douglas Adams' sentient puddle, pondering how amazing it is that the hole in the ground that we sit within is so snugly made for us, and that if it was just 5% less snug, we wouldn't be here at all.
It fits me very neatly. In fact, it fits me so neatly. I mean, really precise, isn't it? It must have been made to have me in it.
Finally,
Yes, that is the famous Douglas Adams argument, which states that it is not the universe which is finely tuned for us, but we are adapting ourselves to the conditions of the universe, and then life emerges. That is, of course, a nonsensical claim based on the fact that the universe itself and the initial conditions of the universe and the initial expansion of the universe, they are finely tuned on the razor's edge. So you have to explain this situation as well. Why is the initial condition of the universe finely tuned, the expansion, the cosmological constant, which is finely tuned in the order of 1 to 10 to the 123rd power, which is absolutely unimaginable how extremely finely tuned that is. That requires an explanation. And you cannot simply say, oh, shuffling and multiverses somehow will explain that fine tuning.
most seriously, I used to think that Arundel Castle is the best castle in England. However, I haven't just changed my mind on this, but I now know for certain that it isn't. It looks gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely not the best castle in England. Portchester Castle, on the other hand, is bloody marvellous. Just look at this beast. Built by the Romans in the 4th century with walls that are 10 feet thick, this absolute beaut has stood the test of time, and it's on my doorstep. Like, seriously, I can see it from my window. So let me just state this unequivocally. Portchester Castle is the best possible castle in any universe. Fact. Consider yourself calmly educated by the knights who say ni.
No! Never! No slamming! Ni! No! No, it's not that. It's ni. No, ni. You're not doing it properly. Ni. Ni, that's it, you've got it.
Anyhow, join me in a few years when I'm no longer convinced that Portchester Castle is the best thing since sliced bread. As always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have supported the channel via other means. I really appreciate it. Oh.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for that video, because once again, as in many previous episodes at your channel, you demonstrate how materialism is in its core completely nonsensical. And you stick to it because you deny God's existence, you suppress the truth because you do not want God to be in your life. You want to live your life autonomously from Him, and that's why God gave you free will, in order for you to be able to do so. He respects that. Now, if you want to claim that materialism is rational, then I think you have just shown how it's not rational. The multiverse is just as nonsensical as it gets. I sincerely hope that you will reflect about my answer to your episode, and I hope that one day you will come aware about how nonsensical that your current position is.